My aunt can't come, can I fill in? Annie Carter stood just inside the front entrance of Whitmore Estate, doing her best not to put too much weight on the blister burning beneath her right heel. Beside her, Duke, the 6-year-old German shepherd who had made every mile with her, sat close enough that his shoulder rested against her leg. His tongue hung slightly from the side of his mouth, but his dark eyes remained fixed on Preston Vale, the man blocking their way as if Annie and the dog had somehow wandered into a place where they had no right to stand. You said your aunt works here. Who exactly are we talking about? Denise Carter, Annie replied, keeping both hands around the folder pressed against her chest. She's worked at this estate for 12 years. The name clearly meant something to him. Preston folded his arms and gave a faint, humorless smile. Denise Carter. Of course. His gaze traveled over Annie's dusty jeans and then dropped toward Duke. Your aunt should have explained the rules before you came marching up to the main house. This is Whitmore Estate, not some neighborhood market where family members simply show up and cover each other's shifts. She didn't send me, Annie said. She didn't even want me to come. That makes this worse, not better. Preston let out a quiet breath through his nose. If Denise wants a raise badly enough, she can come here herself and ask for one. If she chooses to miss the review, then she has to accept the consequences like everyone else. Annie's jaw tightened. She didn't choose anything. She has a fever so high she could barely stand this morning. People get sick, Miss Carter. Adults still have responsibilities. Preston tilted his head as though explaining something painfully obvious to a child. Your aunt has always had a habit of making ordinary hardship sound like some noble sacrifice. If she cannot manage to appear on the one-day Whitmore is reviewing compensation, perhaps that tells us something about how badly she deserves recognition. For a second, Annie forgot the pain in her heel. She has worked here for 12 years, and you think one sick day proves she's lazy? I think reliable employees show up. She has been showing up sick for years because she's afraid you'll punish her if she doesn't. Preston's eyes cooled. I suggest you be very careful about making accusations you don't understand. Duke shifted closer to Annie, sensing the change in her body. Preston noticed and glanced down at him with open irritation. And that dog certainly isn't coming any farther. We have expensive horses on this property, guests moving through the grounds, and employees with actual jobs to do. I'm not turning the estate into a petting zoo because Denise's niece decided to make a family outing of payroll review. His name is Duke, Annie said. I didn't ask his name. No, you just decided he was a problem before he did anything. Preston gave a short laugh, as if Annie had offered the funniest argument he had heard all week. Clever. Now take Duke and go home. Denise's place is in the service wing behind the kitchen, and if she ever bothered teaching you anything about how this estate works, she should have told you that relatives do not wander through the front entrance and demand an audience with the owner. Annie felt the words settle somewhere deeper than simple anger. Her place? Yes, her place, Preston repeated, no longer bothering to hide his contempt. Laundry, storage, cleaning, whatever the house needs. She has been useful back there for years, and there is no reason for you to create a scene because she suddenly thinks she deserves something more. She didn't say that. Then you're doing all this for someone who didn't even ask you to. I'm doing it because she would never do it for herself. Preston's smile disappeared. Go home, Annie. You and your dog are in the way. She remained where she was. I'll leave after someone other than you hears why she isn't here. Preston stepped closer. You need to learn something. People do not walk into places like this and decide who they are entitled to speak to. Annie lifted her chin. Maybe that's how you kept my aunt from speaking. The words changed his face. His voice dropped. Watch yourself. Why? You'll send me to the back of the house too? Preston raised one hand toward a security employee farther down the drive. That's enough. I'm done entertaining this. Before the guard could take more than a step, the sound of tires over gravel drew everyone's attention. A black SUV rolled to a stop near the front steps. Preston turned. Charles Whitmore stepped out carrying a thick stack of folders beneath one arm. He glanced first at Preston, then at Annie, and finally at Duke. What's happening out here, Preston? Nothing serious, sir, Preston answered at once, his voice suddenly smooth and respectful. A relative of one of the housekeeping employees is confused about procedure. She came here insisting that she be allowed to work in her aunt's place, and I was dealing with it before it became a disruption. Annie knew that if she stayed silent for another 5 seconds, Preston would turn the entire morning into his version of events. She stepped forward. You're Mr. Whitmore? Charles stopped. I am. My aunt is Denise Carter. She's worked here for 12 years. Today is the salary review, but she's home with a high fever and can barely get out of bed. Charles's brows drew together. Denise Carter? Yes, sir. Could I fill in for my aunt until she gets better? I promise I won't cause any trouble. He looked at Preston, then back at Annie. If she's sick, she should take the day off. I don't run this place by working people so hard that they have to send a young girl like you in their place. That's because she's afraid to, Annie said, and although emotion tightened her throat, she forced herself to slow down. She works 14-hour days when people call out. She does laundry, cleans guest rooms, helps with storage and kitchen work, and stays until everything is done even when none of it is listed as her responsibility. She comes home exhausted and tells me not to worry because she thinks complaining could cost her the job. Preston moved quickly between them. Mr. Whitmore, this is a teenager repeating things she doesn't understand. Denise is support staff, and she has always been treated appropriately. I'm old, Annie said, turning toward him, and I understand what time my aunt leaves this house. I understand what time she gets home. I understand that she has spent 12 years doing whatever needed to be done, and somehow her file still says she has no extra responsibilities. Charles's attention shifted to the folder in her hands. What file? Her review paperwork. Annie held it out. Charles took it and glanced at the first page. Preston's posture stiffened. Annie continued before fear could stop her. If you want to know whether my aunt deserves to be recognized, then let me do her work today. Let me show you what her normal day actually looks like. Charles looked up from the papers. You've worked here before? No, sir, but my aunt raised me. I know how she works. And the dog? Annie placed a hand lightly on Duke's head. He can work too. He's disciplined, he listens, and he's probably better at following instructions than some people. For the first time, a trace of amusement appeared in Charles's face. You walked here with him? Almost 3 hours. Charles looked down at her dusty shoes, then at Duke's paws. When he raised his eyes again, something had changed. If that dog stays on my property, he works for his food. Annie glanced at Duke, then back at Charles. What does he get paid? Lunch. He eats a lot. Then he'd better be useful. Preston stepped forward. Charles, surely you're not seriously considering. One look from Whitmore stopped him. Charles tucked Denise's file beneath his arm. 1 hour. Miss Carter, you're telling me Denise has been doing more around this estate than I've been told. Fine. Show me. Annie drew a slow breath and nodded. I will. Charles turned toward the house, then looked back at Duke. And keep him out of the kitchen. I can promise that, Annie said, as long as nobody drops bacon. A brief smile crossed Charles's face before he continued up the steps. Annie reached for Duke's collar and followed. Behind them, Preston Vale remained near the entrance, watching her with an expression that made one thing very clear. She had not won anything yet. She had only been allowed through the door, and to Preston, that was already far too much. Preston waited until Charles Whitmore disappeared through the front doors before turning back to Annie. The respectful expression he had worn seconds earlier was gone. You heard him. 1 hour. Don't mistake that for an invitation to make yourself comfortable. I didn't come here to get comfortable, Annie said. She gave Duke's collar a small tug and followed Preston around the side of the house. The front of Whitmore Estate had been all stone steps, tall windows, and polished black doors. The back looked different. Nothing was elegant back here. It was simply busy. Preston pushed open a metal door. This is where staff enter. Your aunt knows that. Annie glanced over her shoulder toward the front entrance they had just left. I didn't. That was obvious. Duke walked beside her without pulling. Several employees looked up as they passed, and more than one face changed when Annie mentioned Denise's name. Preston noticed it too. He stopped beside a gray-haired woman sorting folded napkins onto a cart. Evelyn, Denise's niece, will be helping for 1 hour. Find something simple enough that she can't damage anything expensive. The woman removed her reading glasses and looked at Annie. You're Denise's girl? Niece, Annie said. But yes, ma'am. How is she? Sick. Fever and a bad cough. Evelyn's concern was immediate. That woman has been sounding rough for a week. I told her to see a doctor. Preston cut in. We are not holding a family meeting. Give Annie something to do. Evelyn's eyes moved to him, but she kept her voice even. Of course, Mr. Vale. Preston turned to Annie. Laundry first. Then restock the upstairs guest bathrooms. If you finish that, we'll see whether there's anything else. Annie looked at the 2 full carts beside Evelyn. All of those? Preston smiled. You wanted to do Denise's work. He walked away before she could answer. Evelyn watched him go. Don't let him make you rush. That's when glass gets broken and backs get hurt. I thought this was laundry. It starts as laundry. Around here, everything starts as one thing and turns into 3. Annie smiled faintly. That sounds like my aunt. Evelyn laughed. Then you really are family. But the work didn't stop there. As Annie began folding the sheets and pillowcases, Evelyn noticed how meticulous she was, smoothing every edge until there was hardly a wrinkle left. Who taught you that? My aunt. She says if you make somebody hunt for pillowcases at the end of a long shift, you deserve whatever they say about you. Evelyn shook her head, smiling. That sounds exactly like Denise. Duke lay near the wall, out of the walkway. He watched carts roll past but never moved unless Annie called him. When a young laundry worker dropped a cloth glove beneath a shelving unit, Duke's ears lifted. Annie pointed toward it. Duke, get it. He stood, lowered his head, and carefully pulled the glove out by 2 fingers of fabric. Then he carried it to Annie. The worker laughed. Well, I'll be damned. Language, Evelyn said automatically. The man looked at Annie. Sorry. Annie took the glove from Duke and handed it over. He's heard worse. By the time the first cart was finished, Annie's heel had begun throbbing badly enough that she had to hide a limp. Evelyn noticed anyway. Sit down. I'm fine. That's what Denise says right before she makes things worse. I really am okay. Evelyn crouched and looked at Annie's shoe. Your leg doesn't look right. Annie glanced down. A small red stain had spread near the heel. Evelyn opened a cabinet, took out a first aid box, and handed her 2 adhesive bandages and a packet of antiseptic ointment. Bathroom's there. I don't need. Pride's good, honey. Infection isn't. Annie looked at her for a second, then accepted them. Thank you. 5 minutes later, she was back at the cart. If you feel for Annie, pushing through the pain and refusing to give up while trying to stand up for her aunt, please give this video a like. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because you never know, someone near you might be watching Annie's story right along with you. The guest room supplies came next. Annie followed Evelyn through the service hallway with Duke behind them. Along the shelves were handwritten labels for soap, towels, spare blankets, coffee packets, and toiletries. Annie recognized the blocky writing immediately. That's Aunt Denise's. Evelyn looked where she was pointing. Most of the labels are. She organized this? Years ago. Before that, nobody could find anything after 5 o'clock. At the next closet, Annie found another list in the same handwriting. This one explaining how many towels went into each guest suite and which rooms required hypoallergenic pillows. Did she make this too? Evelyn nodded. Denise makes a lot of things easier around here. Annie looked down the hall. Then why does her review say she has no extra responsibilities? Evelyn's smile faded. Before she could answer, Preston appeared around the corner. You're still on towels? We finished laundry, Annie said. We're doing the bathrooms now. I asked Evelyn. And I'm answering because you asked about my work. Preston's jaw tightened. The West guest rooms need to be ready before lunch. There are 6 of them. Evelyn said. That's usually 2 people. Today it's Annie. He walked away again. Evelyn muttered something Annie could not quite hear. What did you say? I said we'd better get moving. Annie suspected that was not what she had said. They worked through the West rooms together despite Preston's instruction. Annie replaced towels, checked soap trays, wiped fingerprints from mirrors, and learned where everything belonged. In the 3rd room, she noticed a loose drawer handle and wrote it on the maintenance sheet without being asked. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. Denise teach you that too? She says small problems get expensive when people keep walking past them. Near noon, they passed the stable breezeway on the way back toward the service wing. A young horse inside one stall startled when a delivery cart rattled over a metal grate. The animal kicked once against the stall wall, making a teenage groom jump backward. Duke stopped. Stay, Annie said. He sat immediately. The horse snorted. Watching him, Duke lowered his head and remained still. After a few seconds, the horse stopped backing away. The groom let out a breath. That dog's calmer than I am, a voice behind them answered. Apparently he's taking the employment arrangement seriously. Annie turned. Charles Whitmore stood at the end of the breezeway with Denise's review folder tucked beneath his arm. He looked at Duke, then at the neatly stocked cart beside Annie. "Well, Miss Carter," he said, "your hour is almost up." Annie wiped her palms on her jeans. "Then I guess you'll have to decide whether we earned lunch." Charles looked toward Preston, who had just entered the corridor. "No," he said. "I think I've already decided that." Preston's expression changed slightly. Charles handed the folder to him. "Let her finish the day." "Charles, that wasn't the arrangement." "It is now." Then he looked at Duke. "Him too." A few employees nearby tried not to smile. Annie rested her hand on Duke's head, but her eyes stayed on Preston. He said nothing. He did not need to. She had been at Whitmore Estate for less than 2 hours, and already she had learned something Denise had never told her. Her aunt's work was everywhere, only her name was missing. By the time Annie returned to the service wing, lunch was being prepared and the house had changed pace. The morning rush of laundry carts and supply deliveries had given way to the quieter pressure of getting food on tables, guest rooms checked, and afternoon schedules in order. Duke followed at Annie's side, until Evelyn pointed toward a shaded corner near the back courtyard. "He can stay there while we're around food," she said. Mr. Whitmore was serious about the kitchen. "He usually is, when somebody mentions rules," Annie replied. Evelyn gave her a sideways look. "You've known the man 2 hours. I've known Preston about the same amount of time, and that was plenty." Evelyn tried not to laugh. "Careful. That mouth of yours is going to get you into trouble. My aunt says the same thing. Your aunt has good sense." Annie clipped Duke's leash to a heavy iron ring near the courtyard door and crouched beside him. "Stay. I'll bring you something if you don't embarrass me." Duke lowered himself onto the cool concrete with a sigh that made Evelyn smile. "That dog understands more than some men I've worked for." Annie knew exactly which man she meant, but neither of them said his name. Inside the kitchen, 2 cooks were moving between the stove and prep counters. The room smelled of onions, stock, yeast, and coffee. Annie stopped near the doorway because something about the scene felt familiar, even though she had never been there before. A battered wooden spoon rested beside a heavy Dutch oven. On the counter sat a bowl of peeled potatoes and a tray of biscuits waiting for the oven. Evelyn handed Annie a stack of clean side towels. "Put these by the prep station, then take those empty trays down to dish." Annie did as she was told. She had just set the towels down when Charles Whitmore entered through the side door, still carrying 2 folders and checking his phone. One of the cooks straightened instinctively. "Afternoon, Mr. Whitmore." Charles slipped the phone into his pocket. "Afternoon, Tom. Please tell me, lunch is almost ready. I've been in meetings since 7. 10 minutes, maybe 15. Charles looked toward the pot on the stove. "Stew?" "Yes, sir." "That'll do." He moved closer, lifted the lid, and breathed in. His expression changed slightly. Annie noticed because she had spent most of the day watching people's faces before they spoke. Charles picked up a clean spoon, tasted the broth, then frowned. Tom stopped chopping celery. "Something wrong?" "No, not wrong." Charles tasted it again. "Just different." The cook glanced toward the pot as though it might explain itself. "Same beef, same stock." Charles shook his head. "There's something missing." Annie looked into the pot from where she stood. She saw the softened onions and knew immediately what Denise would have complained about. Without thinking, she said, "My aunt usually adds roasted garlic after the onions, not before." The room went quiet enough that Annie realized she had spoken aloud. Charles turned toward her. "Your uncle?" "My aunt," Annie corrected. "Denise." He looked from Annie to the pot. "Denise cooks this?" "All the time." Tom set down his knife slowly. Charles gave a short, puzzled laugh. "I think you may be mistaken. Denise works in housekeeping." Annie stared at him. "She does work in housekeeping. That doesn't answer the question. She cooks too." Charles glanced at Tom. "Does she?" Tom hesitated long enough to make the answer obvious. "Sometimes," he said. Annie almost laughed. "Sometimes?" Evelyn, who had been arranging plates at the far counter, lowered her eyes. Annie pointed toward the stove. "She makes that at home to test it before you come back from trips. Last winter she made 3 batches because she said the beef kept getting dry." Charles's face lost some of its amusement. "When I come back from trips?" "Chicago most of the time. Sometimes New York." Annie began counting on her fingers before she realized how strange the conversation had become. Beef stew when you get back late, biscuits on Saturday mornings, apple cobbler when you have people staying over, Sunday gravy when you're home for the weekend. Charles looked at her more carefully. Sunday gravy? Yes, sir. Thick. Not too sweet. He stopped moving. Annie noticed it and continued more slowly. She says you don't like apples cut too thin in the cobbler because they turn to mush. And she puts less sugar in the biscuits when there's jam on the table. Tom cleared his throat. Charles turned to him. How long has Denise been doing this? Before Tom could answer, Preston entered the kitchen. What's going on? Charles looked at him. Apparently, Denise Carter has been preparing meals for me. Preston barely paused. She helps occasionally when the kitchen is short. Nothing unusual. Annie felt her shoulders tighten. Occasionally? She said. She has burns on both hands from testing your cobbler last Christmas. Preston gave her a warning look. Annie, this is not your concern. It became my concern when she got sick enough to miss work after 12 years of covering everyone else. Charles raised a hand, stopping Preston before he could reply. I want to understand something. Who plans these meals when I'm home? Preston answered smoothly. I coordinate with the kitchen. Of course the staff contributes. And Denise? She assists where needed. Evelyn's hand stopped over the stack of plates. Charles noticed. Evaine? She looked up. Sir? Does Denise assist or does she cook? Evelyn drew a breath. She cooks, Mr. Whitmore, more than once in a while. Preston's jaw tightened. Charles turned back toward the pot. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he looked at Annie again. My mother used to make apple cobbler with thick slices, he said, almost to himself. I've asked for it that way for years. Annie's expression softened. That's why Aunt Denise does it. How would she know that? She said somebody told her once you stopped eating the thin sliced version after your mother passed. She figured if you were still asking for cobbler, maybe you weren't asking just for dessert. The answer seemed to hit Charles somewhere deeper than Annie expected. Preston stepped forward. Charles, we have the compensation meeting in 20 minutes. Charles did not look at him. Get me Denise Carter's full employment file. I can have HR send it later. Now, Preston's face changed almost imperceptibly. Charles finally turned toward him. Every review, every title change, every overtime record, every supervisor note. 12 years. Preston hesitated. Charles's voice remained calm. Was there something unclear about that? No. Good. Preston left without another word. Annie watched him go. She had expected satisfaction, maybe even relief. Instead, she felt something colder. Preston had spent the whole morning trying to get her out of the house. Now, for the first time, she understood why. Charles set his spoon down. Miss Carter? Yes, sir? You said your aunt tests these recipes at home? All the time. Then when she's feeling better, I believe I owe her a conversation. Annie met his eyes. I think you owe her more than one. Charles held her gaze for a moment, then nodded. This time, he did not seem offended. And across the kitchen, Evelyn quietly smiled. Preston returned 20 minutes later carrying a thick personnel folder, but by then Annie had already been pulled back into the rhythm of the house. Evelyn had sent her to the laundry room with a stack of table linens, then to the upstairs hall with fresh towels for 2 guest suites. Everywhere she went, she found signs of Denise's hands. Labels written in the same careful block letters Annie had seen on grocery lists at home. Maintenance notes tucked into supply cabinets. Small reminders taped inside drawers so newer employees would know what belonged where. At first, Annie found it comforting. Then it began to bother her. Her aunt seemed to be everywhere in Whitmore Estate, yet her name appeared nowhere that mattered. She was standing on a step stool replacing folded bath towels when a young housekeeper named Carla came in carrying a tray of bottled water. You're Denise's niece, right? Annie stepped down. That obvious? Carla smiled. You organize things the same way she does. I didn't know there was a Denise Carter method. There is. Everything has a place, and if you put it in the wrong place, she'll stare at you until you move it yourself. Annie laughed. That definitely sounds like her. Carla set the tray down. Tell her I hope she feels better. She covered 3 of my shifts when my little boy had pneumonia last winter. She never told me that. She probably wouldn't. Carla hesitated, then added, She doesn't talk much about what she does here. Annie looked around the room. I'm beginning to notice. Before Carla could answer, Preston appeared in the doorway. Carla, I believe you have work downstairs. The warmth left the room almost instantly. Yes, Mr. Vale. Carla picked up the empty tray and left. Preston waited until they were alone before turning to Annie. You seem very interested in collecting stories. I'm talking to people. You're here temporarily, not conducting an investigation. I didn't know conversation required permission. His jaw tightened. You have spent the day turning ordinary workplace arrangements into something sinister, because you don't understand how a property this size operates. Annie stepped off the stool and folded it against the wall. Then explain it to me. I don't owe you an explanation. That's what I thought. Preston lowered his voice. Your aunt has lasted 12 years here because she understands when to keep her head down and do her job. You would be wise not to make her return difficult. The threat was quiet enough that Annie almost wondered whether she had imagined it. Almost. She looked directly at him. Are you saying you'd punish her because I talked to Mr. Whitmore? I'm saying actions have consequences. For her? For everyone. Annie felt the urge to snap back, but Denise's warning returned to her. Don't let anger do your talking. She took a slow breath. Then I guess you should be careful what actions you take too. Preston studied her for a second, then walked away. Only after he disappeared did Annie realize how tightly she had been gripping the folded step stool. Duke was waiting in the service courtyard when she came downstairs. The moment he saw her, his tail began sweeping the concrete. Annie crouched and rubbed both hands through the fur around his neck. At least you don't have a management style, she murmured. A stable hand nearby laughed. Give him a clipboard in 6 months. Duke looked toward the man as if considering the promotion. The stable hand tossed a soft leather glove onto a nearby bench. Let's see if the new employee's still earning his lunch. Annie pointed. Duke, bring it. Duke trotted over, took the glove carefully, and carried it back. The man accepted it with a grin. Better than my last assistant. You had an assistant? No, that's why he's better. A few employees laughed, and for the first time since arriving, Annie noticed something she had missed earlier. When Preston wasn't nearby, people relaxed. Conversations lasted longer. Shoulders dropped. Someone turned up a small radio near the loading dock. A kitchen worker brought Duke a bowl of water without being asked. Then Charles Whitmore stepped into the courtyard with Denise's file under one arm. The conversations quieted, but not with the same tension Preston caused. Charles noticed Duke first. Still employed? The stable hand nodded toward the glove. Hardest working dog on the property, sir. Annie scratched Duke behind one ear. He'd like that in writing. Charles almost smiled. We'll discuss benefits later. He turned toward Annie, and the humor faded. Do you have a minute? She nodded. They moved a few steps away from the others. Charles opened the folder and glanced at the first page. Your aunt's official title is housekeeping attendant. That's what I told you? Yes. He turned another page. What I'm trying to understand is why half the people I've spoken with today describe her as though she supervises half the domestic operation. Annie looked toward the service doors. Maybe you should ask the man who writes her reviews. I did. And? Charles closed the folder. He says she prefers staying in the background. Annie gave a short, disbelieving laugh. She prefers getting paid on Friday. That's not the same thing. Charles's eyes sharpened slightly. She ever tell you she didn't want more responsibility? No. She talks about being tired. She talks about people calling her when they can't find things. She talks about fixing schedules when somebody doesn't show up. She talks about going into the kitchen because a guest doesn't eat dairy. Or staying late because the upstairs rooms aren't ready. Annie paused, but she never once said she liked being invisible. Charles looked back down at the folder. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he asked, Do you know what she makes? No, she doesn't talk about money unless there isn't enough of it. Something in that answer made him look at Annie differently. He turned another page and frowned. What? Charles hesitated. There's almost no overtime listed. Annie stared at him. That can't be right. How late does she usually get home? 7 if it's a good day, 9 or 10 when you have guests, sometimes later. And what time does she leave home? Before 5:30. Charles looked again at the numbers. That doesn't make sense. No, Annie said quietly. It doesn't. Preston appeared at the far end of the courtyard carrying another stack of papers. When he saw Charles with Annie, his pace slowed. Charles noticed. Miss Carter, finish what Evelyn gives you today. Then go home and take care of your aunt. Annie nodded, but her attention remained on the file. Are you going to keep looking? Charles closed it under his arm. Yes. How far? His eyes moved toward Preston, who was now approaching. As far as the records go? For the first time that day, Annie saw something in Preston's face that had not been there at the front entrance. Not irritation, not contempt, fear. She rested one hand on Duke's head and watched Charles walk back toward the main house with Denise's file in his possession. The estate had spent 12 years depending on her aunt's work. Now, finally, someone with the power to ask questions had begun asking them. By late afternoon, Annie's feet felt heavier than they had during the walk to Whitmore Estate, but she kept moving because every room seemed to reveal another piece of Denise's life that had never made it home. In the laundry room, one worker told her Denise had trained nearly every new housekeeper hired in the past 5 years. In the pantry, another employee showed her a handwritten rotation chart Denise had created after food kept expiring before anyone used it. Near the guest wing, Annie found a maintenance notebook filled with short reminders in her aunt's familiar handwriting. Loose hinge in room 6, window latch sticking in West Hall, upstairs faucet dripping again. None of it sounded important by itself. Together, it made Annie wonder how an employee with no supervisory responsibilities had become the person everyone relied on when something went wrong. Evelyn found her reading the maintenance notebook. "You planning to memorize the whole estate before supper?" Annie closed it. "Did Aunt Denise always do this much?" Evelyn leaned against the linen cart. "Depends what you mean by always. When she first came here, she cleaned rooms and did laundry like the rest of us. Then somebody quit, so Denise covered the linen inventory. Somebody else had a baby and needed fewer hours, so Denise helped with scheduling. The kitchen got short-handed, and she stepped in there too. After a while, people stopped asking whether something was Denise's job. They just expected her to do it. That happens to dependable people." Annie looked at the notebook again. "Then why didn't anybody make her a supervisor?" Evelyn's expression became more guarded. "A few of us asked that question. And?" Mr. Vale always had an answer. "What kind of answer?" Evelyn hesitated before speaking. "That Denise was more useful where she was. That she didn't have the right background for management. That guests expected a certain kind of presentation in the front of the house." Annie understood the meaning beneath the words. "He said that? Not always exactly like that. He didn't have to." Evelyn gave her a tired look. "No, honey. Men like Preston usually learn how to say ugly things in clean language." Before Annie could answer, Charles entered the hallway with Denise's personnel file tucked beneath his arm. He had removed his jacket and rolled his sleeves to his forearms. The polished businessman Annie had first seen outside now looked more like a man who had spent several hours discovering that his own records did not match his own house. "Evelyn, may I ask you something?" She straightened. "Of course, Mr. Whitmore. How long have you worked here?" 17 years in March." Charles nodded. "Then you knew Denise when she started?" "I did. Has she ever told you she did not want a promotion?" Evelyn looked briefly at Annie, then back at Charles. "No, sir. Has she ever refused additional responsibility?" A faint smile crossed Evelyn's face. "Mr. Whitmore, Denise has trouble refusing work when she knows somebody else will have to stay late and do it." Charles absorbed that. "Preston tells me she preferred remaining in housekeeping. She preferred keeping her paycheck." The answer came gently, but it landed hard. Charles lowered his eyes to the file. "Did anyone ever recommend her for advancement?" "I did. Twice." Annie turned toward her. Charles's head came up. "You submitted recommendations?" "Yes, sir. One maybe 4 years ago. Another 2 years after that. There's nothing here." Evelyn's mouth tightened. "I gave both to Mr. Vale." For several seconds, Charles said nothing. "Do you have copies?" "The second one, maybe. I learned after the first." That produced the first real change in Charles's face. Not anger exactly, but something more deliberate. "Would you find it for me?" "Yes, sir." "And Evelyn?" She paused. "Don't give it to Preston." Her eyes widened slightly. "Understood." Charles walked away without another word. Annie watched him disappear around the corner. He really didn't know. Evelyn began pushing the linen cart. Not knowing can be innocent once. Staying ignorant after people depend on you is another matter. The words stayed with Annie. Her phone vibrated in her pocket a few minutes later. "Denise." Annie answered immediately. "How are you feeling?" "I'd feel better if my niece were home instead of starting a revolution at my workplace." Annie smiled despite herself. "Evelyn told you?" Evelyn has never kept a secret longer than a coffee break. "I'm almost done." "Annie." The concern in Denise's voice changed her expression. "What?" "Preston called me. Annie stopped walking. He called you while you're sick? He wanted to know whether I authorized you to take my papers. You know I took them. That isn't what I'm worried about. He said you were making accusations and interfering with work. I'm doing the work he gave me. I know that, baby. I also know that man. Annie moved away from the others and lowered her voice. He's been hiding things from Mr. Whitmore. Annie, listen to me. You don't know how much power Preston has around there. Maybe not as much as he thinks. That is exactly the kind of sentence that makes me nervous. Annie closed her eyes for a second. Did you want a promotion? Silence came from the other end. Aunt Denise? I wanted to be paid for the work I was already doing. Did Preston ever tell you why you weren't considered? Denise coughed before answering. He said I was dependable in the back of the house. Said moving me would create more problems than it solved. Annie looked toward the polished hallway leading to the front rooms. So he punished you for being good at your job. That isn't how he'd say it. I don't care how he'd say it. I know, Denise's voice softened. That's why I'm telling you not to let your anger make decisions for you. Annie glanced down at Duke, who had settled beside her feet. I'm trying. Try harder. Then come home. I will. When the call ended, Annie stood there for another moment before slipping the phone into her pocket. At the far end of the corridor, Preston had appeared without her noticing. He walked toward her slowly. Your aunt has more sense than you do. Annie's stomach tightened. Were you listening? I don't need to listen. I know Denise. She understands what happens when people turn a workplace into a personal crusade. Is that a threat? It's advice. Preston stopped a few feet away. Mr. Whitmore will lose interest. He always does. Meetings, flights, another city, another problem. Then I'll still be here. Annie looked at him carefully. For the first time, Preston's confidence sounded less like certainty and more like something he needed both of them to believe. Before she could answer, Charles's voice carried from the study entrance. Preston. He stood there holding another sheet of paper. Come inside. We need to discuss Denise Carter. Preston's face changed. Only for an instant, but Annie saw it, and so did Duke. Preston entered Charles Whitmore's study with the controlled expression of a man determined not to show that anything had unsettled him. Annie remained in the hallway with Duke beside her, unsure whether she was supposed to leave. Charles had not invited her into the room, but neither had he told her to go home. A few seconds later, the door closed. Evelyn appeared from the service corridor carrying a folded sheet of paper inside a clear plastic sleeve. Found it. The recommendation? The second one. She looked toward the study. I kept a copy because the first disappeared. Annie took in the neat paragraphs and the date from 2 years earlier. Near the bottom, Evelyn had written that Denise routinely trained new employees, managed linen inventory when supervisors were absent, coordinated guest room preparation, and had demonstrated the judgment and reliability required for a supervisory role. You wrote all this? I meant every word. Why didn't you give it directly to Mr. Whitmore? Evelyn sighed. Because people working in a house like this don't normally skip over the estate manager and knock on the owner's door. Preston made sure everyone understood that. Annie stared at the study. He told me Mr. Whitmore always loses interest. He's counting on that. Inside, Charles laid Denise's personnel file on the desk and pushed it toward Preston. You told me Denise never showed interest in advancement. Preston took a seat without being asked. I said she was well suited to her current role. That isn't the same thing. No, but after 12 years, Charles, I would assume a grown woman capable of wanting something could say so herself. Charles leaned back. Evelyn recommended her for promotion. A short pause. Evelyn recommends everyone she likes. Twice. Preston shifted slightly. I don't remember every internal note that crosses my desk. Chaarge Alice opened the file. That's interesting, because you signed this evaluation 3 weeks after Evelyn says she submitted the second recommendation. Preston looked at the page but did not touch it. You rated Denise highly for reliability, initiative, and training new employees. Charles continued. Then you marked her as not recommended for promotion. There are qualities required in management that don't fit neatly onto an evaluation form. Zuhas? Presentation, authority, communication, the ability to represent the estate. Charles's eyes narrowed. Represent it to whom? Guests, vendors, outside partners. You know how these things work. I'm beginning to wonder whether I do. Preston exhaled and sat back. Charles, you hired me because you didn't want to spend your life deciding who folds sheets or schedules housekeepers. I've kept this estate running while you built the company. I hired you to manage people, not decide which ones I was allowed to notice. That is not what happened. Charles turned another page. Then explain the overtime. Preston's expression tightened. Denise regularly works 10 and 12-hour days. Annie says there are times she doesn't get home until 10 at night. Yet according to these records, Denise averages less overtime than employees working far fewer events. You're taking the word of an 18-year-old over payroll records? I'm asking why the two don't match. Flexible scheduling, comp time, shift adjustments, documented where. Preston's eyes flicked toward the file. Charles noticed. You don't know. I don't personally process every timesheet. No, but you approve them. That's why we have supervisors. And according to half the people I spoke with today, Denise is the person those supervisors call when they need something fixed. Preston leaned forward. You are turning one teenager's complaints into an indictment of a system that has worked for years. Charles's voice remained calm. A system can work very well for the person sitting on top of it. For the first time, Preston looked openly irritated. What exactly do you think I've done? I don't know yet. The answer bothered Preston more than an accusation would have. Charles closed the file. That's why I'm going to find out. There was a knock at the door. Evelyn stepped inside after Charles answered. Annie stayed in the hall. I found the copy you asked for, sir. She handed him the recommendation. Charles read it once, then again. Preston looked at Evelyn. You kept copies of internal management documents? It was my recommendation, Mr. Vale. You should have followed retention procedure. Evelyn met his eyes. I followed the procedure the first time. It disappeared. Silence settled over the room. Charles looked up from the page. Thank you, Evelyn. She nodded and left. Preston stood. If we're done, I have an estate to run. Charles did not move. We're not done. We're simply done for this minute. Preston stopped at the door. I want every timesheet for Denise Carter for the last 3 years, every schedule change, every performance review, and every promotion recommendation submitted by anyone on the domestic staff. That will take time. Then start. And the girl? Charles glanced past him and saw Annie in the hallway. What about her? She has disrupted half the house, questioned management in front of employees, and inserted herself into matters she doesn't understand. Annie's shoulders stiffened. Charles considered Preston for a moment. She folded sheets, stocked rooms, helped in the service wing, and walked 3 hours to get here because her aunt was too sick to stand. If that qualifies as disruption, perhaps we should have more of it. Preston's lips pressed together. Charles added, she finishes the day. That decision is not up for discussion. Preston walked out without acknowledging Annie. As he passed, Duke rose from the floor but remained beside her. Charles called from inside. Miss Carter. Annie entered cautiously. He held Evelyn's recommendation in one hand. Did your aunt ever tell you she trained new employees? Not exactly. She complained that some people fold towels like they're angry at them. Charles almost smiled. Did she tell you she helped manage schedules? She said people called her whenever someone didn't show up. I thought that was normal. So did I. There was something in his voice Annie had not heard before. Not anger. Disappointment. Perhaps. But aimed partly at himself. Charles placed the recommendation on the desk. I want you to understand something. I'm not going to decide what happened here because you told me one version and Preston told me another. I need records. I need to speak with people. If someone has been treated unfairly, I need to know exactly how. Annie nodded slowly. That's fair. No, Charles said. Fair would have been noticing before today. This is just the work that comes after. Annie looked at him for a moment. Then she asked, are you really going to keep looking when you leave again? Charles understood the question immediately. Preston told you I wouldn't. He said you'd get on another plane and forget. Charles leaned back in his chair. He may have had reasons to believe that. That answer surprised her. But he doesn't anymore, Charles added. Annie's phone buzzed. Another message from Denise. Please come home when you can. Don't turn this into something you have to carry by yourself. Annie read it twice. Charles noticed her expression. Your aunt? She wants me home. You should go when your work is finished. Annie nodded, then looked at the file again. I just don't want all this to disappear when I walk out. Charles rested his hand on the folder. It won't. Outside the study, Preston stood at the far end of the corridor speaking quietly into his phone. When he saw Annie come out, he ended the call. Neither of them said anything. They did not need to. For 12 years, Denise Carter had survived at Whitmore Estate by being useful enough to depend on and quiet enough to overlook. Now the paperwork had begun to speak for her. The rest of the afternoon moved more slowly. But for Charles Whitmore, the house no longer looked the way it had that morning. He had walked through the same halls for years without wondering who stocked a cabinet, who stayed late when a guest changed plans, or who quietly kept a dozen small problems from becoming larger ones. Now, every time he passed a service cart or heard someone call Denise's name, he found himself stopping. Annie noticed it first in the laundry room. Charles came in without Preston and asked a middle-aged woman named Marjorie, who normally handled linen shortages during busy weekends. "Denise," Marjorie answered without hesitation. "She keeps track of what we're low on before the rest of us notice." "Is that part of her job?" Marjorie looked uncertain. "Not officially, sir." "Then why does she do it?" "Because if she doesn't, somebody ends up short at the wrong time." Charles nodded, wrote something on a yellow legal pad, then asked, "Who trained you when you started?" Marjorie smiled. "Denise. She told me not to let Mr. Vale scare me into moving faster than I could work safely." Annie, standing nearby with a stack of folded towels, looked down to hide a smile. Charles heard it anyway. "That sounds familiar." "It should," Annie said. "She's been telling me some version of that my whole life." A few minutes later, he crossed to the kitchen. Tom, the cook, was trimming vegetables when Charles asked who usually adjusted meals when guests had allergies or special requests. Tom wiped his hands on a towel. "Denise catches a lot of that." "Why her?" "Because she remembers things. Mrs. Grayson can't have dairy. Mr. Ellis hates mushrooms. Your cousin likes his coffee weak enough to see through. Denise remembers all of it." Charles frowned. "And Preston?" Tom hesitated. "Mr. Vale remembers what needs approving." It was a careful answer, but Charles understood it. At the stables, the pattern repeated. One of the grooms told him Denise had once brought homemade soup after his wife spent a week in the hospital. A grounds worker remembered Denise switching shifts so he could attend his daughter's high school graduation. Another employee said she often stayed after clock-out time to help reset guest rooms when events ran late. Charles asked the same question each time. Was she paid for that? The answers were rarely certain. Annie watched him take notes until his handwriting began to crowd the margins. Near sunset, the sky beyond the windows turned the muted gold of a Kentucky evening. Charles stood alone for a moment near the back hall, looking toward the service yard where employees moved between buildings. A memory surfaced that had nothing to do with Denise. His father had owned 3 delivery trucks before Whitmore Logistics became a company anyone recognized. When Charles was 14, he had spent Saturdays sitting behind a scarred wooden desk in a warehouse that smelled of diesel and cardboard. His father knew every driver by name. He knew whose mother had cancer, whose son had enlisted, who needed an advance before Christmas. At the time, Charles had thought it inefficient. People work better when you know who they are, his father had told him once. Charles had rolled his eyes. Now, standing in a house where one woman had worked 12 years without him understanding what she actually did, he finally heard the sentence differently. Preston found him there. "We need to leave for the compensation meeting," he said. "You've already pushed the schedule back twice." Charles turned. "Then push it again." "Charles, we have department heads waiting." "Good. They can wait another 15 minutes. Preston exhaled. "This is exactly what I was trying to avoid." One employee misses work. Her niece appears at the front door, and suddenly we're treating ordinary staffing complaints like a federal investigation. Charles looked at him. "I'm asking who does what in my house, and I'm telling you that's what you hired me for." Charles's expression hardened. "No, I hired you so I could trust what happened when I wasn't here." Preston went quiet. Charles continued, "Those are not the same thing. You think I've been hiding people from you? I think I don't yet know what you've been doing, and every hour today has given me another reason to find out." Preston rubbed one hand across his jaw. "You cannot run a property like this by listening to every complaint. Staff talk. They exaggerate. They resent management. Somebody always thinks they deserve more." Charles glanced through the open doorway toward Annie, who was helping Evelyn restock a cart. "And sometimes they do." Preston followed his gaze. "You're letting that girl influence you." "She influenced me enough to ask a question. The answers are coming from everyone else." That left Preston with nothing useful to say. A few minutes later, Charles joined the compensation meeting, but the mood had changed. He asked every supervisor to explain why certain employees had or had not received raises. He requested actual duty lists instead of job titles. When someone said a worker was reliable, he asked what that meant in hours, responsibilities, and training. Annie did not hear the meeting. She only saw department heads entering stiffly and leaving thoughtful. Evelyn leaned against the cart beside her. Mr. Whitmore has never asked this many questions in one day. Is that good? It depends who you are. Annie looked toward Preston's office. So probably not good for him. Evelyn gave her a small smile. Probably not. By early evening, Annie's legs ached and Duke had curled up beside the service door with his head on his paws. She sat for a moment on the bench beside him and checked her phone. Denise had sent another message asking when she was coming home. Soon, Annie typed back. Before she could put the phone away, Charles appeared at the end of the corridor. Miss Carter, I'm going through the rest of the staff records tonight. You don't need to stay for that. Annie rose. You're really going to keep looking? Yes. Even after I leave? Charles gave a tired half smile. Especially after you leave. You've done enough for one day. Annie glanced toward Duke. He'd disagree. He hasn't had dinner yet. Charles looked at the dog. Fair point. For the first time all day, Annie laughed without forcing it. She still did not trust the house. She certainly did not trust Preston. But as Charles walked back toward his study carrying another stack of files, one thing felt different. He was no longer looking at Whitmore Estate as something that simply worked. He had begun asking who was carrying it. Annie had just finished tying Duke's leash when Evelyn came through the service door carrying a paper bag wrapped at the top with 2 tight folds. Before you go, take this home to Denise. Chicken soup, biscuits, and enough apple cobbler to make her forget she's sick for 5 minutes. Annie accepted the bag with both hands. She'll tell me you made too much. I did make too much. That's how I make sure she eats. Duke raised his nose toward the bag. Evelyn pointed at him. Not yours. He sat back down, though the look he gave her suggested the matter was still under negotiation. Outside, the light had almost gone. Cold settled over the estate, and the first lamps along the drive had come on. Annie glanced toward the long road beyond the gates and tried not to think about walking it again on a blistered heel. Evelyn noticed. You're not walking home. I got here walking. That wasn't what I said. I'll be fine. You young people use that sentence like it's medical evidence. Annie smiled. I'll call somebody if I need to. You'd better. Before Annie could leave, Duke stopped beside her. His head turned toward the east wing of the house. Annie tugged gently on the leash. Come on. He did not move. His ears rose. Then somewhere beyond the hallway came a dull sound, heavy enough to be heard through 2 closed doors. Duke pulled once toward the house. What was that? Annie asked. Evelyn listened. Could have been something falling. Duke pulled again, harder this time. Duke, easy. He ignored her command, which was unusual enough to make Annie stop resisting. The dog led her down the corridor toward Charles Whitmore's study. When they reached the closed door, Duke began scratching at it, then gave a short, sharp bark. Annie frowned. Duke. He barked again. Evelyn caught up behind them. He doesn't normally do that, does he? No. Annie knocked. Mr. Whitmore? Nothing. She knocked harder. Mr. Whitmore, it's Annie. Still nothing. Duke whined and pressed his nose against the gap beneath the door. Preston appeared from the adjoining hall, irritation already on his face. What is going on now? Something happened in there. Mr. Whitmore is working. I heard something fall. He's had a long day. Leave him alone. Duke barked again. Preston's patience snapped. Get that dog away from the door. Annie stared at him. He doesn't act like this for no reason. He's a dog. He listens better than you have all day. Annie. Evelyn stepped between them slightly. Mr. Vale. Maybe we should just check. Preston looked at her. Charles does not appreciate staff barging into his private study because an animal is excited. Annie knocked again, hard enough that her knuckles hurt. Mr. Whitmore. No answer. Her stomach tightened. I'm opening it. You are absolutely not. Then you do it. Preston said nothing. That silence made her decision for her. Annie turned to Evelyn. Is there an emergency key? Evelyn hesitated. Housekeeping keeps a master for occupied rooms, but we're not supposed to use it without authorization unless there's an emergency. This feels like one. Preston stepped forward. I'm telling you to leave that door alone. Annie looked straight at him. Then you can explain later why you stopped us from checking. For the first time, he had no immediate answer. Evelyn hurried to the locked cabinet down the corridor, returned with a labeled key ring, and handed Annie the study key. "Let me," Evelyn said. Annie shook her head. "Stay out here with Duke." She unlocked the door. The moment it opened, Duke surged forward, but Annie caught his collar. "Stay." Inside, the study lamp was still on. Papers were scattered across the floor near the desk. Charles lay on his side beside the chair. "Mr. Whitmore." Annie rushed toward him. He did not respond. She knelt and touched his shoulder. "Mr. Whitmore." "Can you hear me?" His eyes fluttered but did not open. Annie reached for her phone. Then the room seemed to tilt. She blinked hard. A sudden pressure built behind her forehead, and nausea rolled through her stomach. For 1 second, she thought she had stood up too fast. Then she remembered the heater humming along the wall. Something was wrong with the room. She backed toward the door. "Evelyn, call 911. Now." Preston stared at her. "What happened?" "I don't know. I got dizzy as soon as I went in." Evelyn already had her phone out. Annie pulled her sleeve over her hand, opened the nearest window as far as she could without staying inside longer than necessary, then returned to Charles with Preston and another employee. "Help me get him to the hall." Preston hesitated. Annie snapped, "Move." The three of them dragged Charles across the carpet and into the corridor. Once clear of the room, Annie dropped to her knees beside him. Duke came immediately to Charles's side and pressed his nose against the man's shoulder. Within minutes, sirens approached from the main road. Firefighters entered with meters clipped to their gear. One stopped near the study doorway and looked at the reading. "Everybody out of this wing." Annie's chest tightened. "What is it?" "Carbon monoxide." Preston's face drained. Paramedics placed oxygen on Charles and checked Annie after she admitted she had been inside the room. "You have a headache?" one asked. "Yes." "Nausea?" "A little." "You're getting oxygen too." "I'm fine." The paramedic gave her a look Evelyn would have approved of. That wasn't the question. Annie stopped arguing. Charles began to come around as they moved him toward the ambulance. His eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then settled on Annie. Duke stood several feet away with Evelyn holding his leash. Charles lifted a hand weakly toward the dog. "So," he murmured through the oxygen mask. The dog finally earned his lunch. Annie let out the breath she had been holding. "I think he's up to dinner now." A tired smile appeared in Charles's eyes. Then he looked toward the fire captain standing nearby. "How does carbon monoxide build up in a room like that?" The captain removed one glove. "Could be a cracked heat exchanger, venting problem, blocked flue. We'll know more after inspection. But something this serious usually gives warning signs before somebody ends up on the floor." Charles turned his head. His gaze found Preston. "When was that system last inspected?" Preston opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The ambulance doors closed a few seconds later. Annie stood beside Duke in the cold driveway, the untouched bag of soup still waiting by the service door. All day, they had been uncovering things Denise had done without recognition. Now Duke had uncovered something else, and this time, it had nearly killed the man who owned the house. Charles Whitmore was discharged the following morning with a headache, a bruised shoulder from the fall, and strict instructions to take the day slowly. He ignored the last part almost immediately. By 8:30, he was sitting in a private office at Whitmore Logistics, with a bottle of water beside him and 3 people across the table: the company's HR director, outside counsel, and an independent safety contractor he had used on warehouse projects. Preston had not been invited. Charles slid a yellow folder across the table. "I want every maintenance record connected to the east wing at the estate. Heating, ventilation, carbon monoxide alarms, service calls, replacement recommendations, everything." The contractor, a broad-shouldered man named Rick Hanley, nodded. "How far back?" 3 years. The attorney glanced at Charles. "You're expecting to find a pattern?" "I'm expecting not to guess." That answer ended the discussion. At Whitmore Estate, Annie had gone home before midnight after Evelyn finally convinced her that Denise needed her more than the house did. Duke slept almost the entire ride back, curled across the back seat of a groundskeeper's pickup. Denise had cried when Annie walked through the door, though she denied it while pulling her into an embrace. "You walked there, worked all day, nearly got poisoned, and somehow this is what you call helping?" Denise said, holding Annie by the shoulders. "I didn't nearly get poisoned. You were on oxygen. For a little while. That sentence does not improve the story." Annie smiled despite herself. "Mr. Whitmore is alive." So are you, and I'd like to keep both of us that way. Duke pushed between them until Denise finally bent down and wrapped one arm around his neck. And you? She murmured. You had to go save a billionaire because one family wasn't enough trouble? Duke leaned into her. Annie watched them, but her mind stayed on Preston's face when the fire captain mentioned warning signs. He had not looked confused. He had looked afraid. By late morning, Charles was looking at the reason. Rick Hanley spread several maintenance reports across the conference table. The system didn't fail without warning. Charles leaned forward. Rick tapped the first page. 18 months ago, a service technician noted irregular burner operation. 6 months later, another inspection flagged poor venting. Then 4 months ago, elevated carbon monoxide was recorded near the mechanical room. Charles's expression hardened. How elevated? Not enough at that point to trigger evacuation, but enough to require follow-up. Was follow-up done? Rick slid another document toward him. Replacement of the heat exchanger was recommended. Full system replacement was listed as the safer, long-term option. Charles read the bottom of the page. Deferred budget review. Below it was Preston Vale's approval signature. Charles read it again. The HR director, Margaret Shaw, spoke carefully. Could Preston have believed the repair wasn't urgent? Rick shook his head. Not after the second warning. Maybe you delay a cosmetic repair. You don't ignore repeated combustion and venting issues on a gas heating system. Charles looked at the next document. Another recommendation. Another deferral. His hand tightened around the paper. How much would the replacement have cost? Depending on the unit, maybe $25,000 to $30,000. Charles stared at him. He owned aircraft, warehouses, distribution centers. $25,000 was not enough money to delay a safety repair in a room where anyone could have died. Why would Preston care about saving that amount? Margaret exchanged a glance with the attorney. His compensation package includes a performance bonus tied partly to estate operating costs. Charles sat back. There it was. Not murder. Not some elaborate attempt on his life. Something smaller and, in its own way, uglier. A man had looked at a safety warning and decided a clean budget mattered more. The attorney leaned forward. Charles, we should be precise here. A bonus structure alone doesn't prove intent. We need the emails, approval chain, and whether anyone pushed back. I don't need intent to know he saw the reports. No. But if you're going to take disciplinary action, we document it correctly. Charles nodded. Do it correctly. Just don't do it slowly. Margaret opened another folder. There's something else. She placed printed emails on the table. The first came from a maintenance supervisor asking for authorization to replace the damaged unit. Preston's response was short. Hold until Q4. We're already over target on property maintenance. The supervisor replied that postponement was not recommended. Preston answered again. Monitor for now. No replacement without my authorization. Charles read the exchange without speaking. Rick broke the silence. That's not a misunderstanding. No, Charles said quietly. It isn't. His thoughts went back to the night before. The pressure behind his eyes, the floor tilting, waking to an oxygen mask while Annie sat nearby with one of her own. Then he imagined the same thing happening to Denise while she worked late, or to one of the housekeepers cleaning the study, or to a guest sleeping down the hall. What about the detectors? Rick flipped to another page. One unit in that wing was past recommended service life. Another had a missing maintenance confirmation. Charles looked up sharply. Meaning? Meaning somebody should have verified replacement and didn't. Charles pushed away from the table and stood, then immediately steadied himself against the chair when a wave of dizziness reminded him that his body had not finished recovering. Margaret frowned. Sit down. I'm fine. You were treated for carbon monoxide poisoning less than 12 hours ago. Charles looked at her. Margaret did not blink. Being the owner doesn't make you medically interesting. For the first time that morning, a tired smile touched his face. He sat. Then the smile disappeared. I want the entire estate inspected. Heating, electrical, fire systems, alarms, staff quarters, barns, Abor's guest areas. If there is a deferred safety item, I want it identified today. Rick nodded. And no more safety repairs get delayed because somebody wants a better quarterly number. The attorney made a note. I'll draft the policy change. Charles looked down at Preston's signature again. For years, he had believed that hiring capable people meant he did not have to bother with details. Preston had encouraged that belief because it gave him room to control what Charles saw. Now a girl had walked through his front door and a dog had refused to leave the study door. Both had noticed something Charles had missed. He picked up the maintenance reports. "After safety," he said. "We open payroll." Margaret looked at him. "Denise Carter?" "Denise first." He glanced at the stack of deferred repairs. Then everyone else. By the third day, the maintenance audit had already confirmed enough problems to keep Charles Whitmore angry. But payroll turned that anger into something harder to dismiss. Margaret Shaw arrived at the estate shortly after 8 with 2 members of her HR team and a forensic payroll consultant. They worked out of a conference room near the library, far from Preston's office, and Charles made one instruction clear before they began. "Nothing goes through Mr. Vale. If you need records, pull them directly from accounting, HR, or the timekeeping system." Margaret nodded. "And if he asks what we're reviewing, tell him the truth. Everything." Preston had been placed on restricted administrative duty while the safety review continued. He could remain on the property, but his access to payroll, personnel files, and maintenance systems had been suspended. Charles had not fired him yet. He wanted the facts assembled in an order no lawyer, employee, or future board member could later call impulsive. By noon, the first payroll summary was on the table. The consultant, Dana Brooks, slid a spreadsheet toward Charles. "Denise Carter's hours don't match the pattern described by the staff." Charles looked over the columns. "Explain." "Her scheduled shifts average about 40 hours a week. There are occasional overtime entries, but far fewer than we'd expect based on event calendars and shift coverage. On several dates when other employees remember her staying late, her time record shows exactly 8 hours." Margaret pointed to another column. "We also found manual edits." "By whom?" "Most were approved under Preston Vale's manager credentials." Charles's jaw tightened. "What kind of edits?" Dana turned the laptop toward him. "Clock out at 9:43 p.m. Changed to 6 p.m. here. Another night changed from 10:11 to 7. Some may have legitimate explanations, but there are enough of them that we need to interview the supervisors." Charles stared at the screen. "Was Denise ever told?" "We don't know yet. Find out." The interviews began that afternoon. Marjorie from laundry said Denise often clocked out when Preston told staff the budget was too high, then stayed another hour to finish because leaving work undone meant someone else would inherit it in the morning. Carla admitted that Denise had once told her, "Go home to your boy, I'll finish the rooms." Miss Evelyn remembered arguing with Denise about the same habit more than once. "You knew she stayed after clocking out?" Margaret asked. Evelyn sighed. "I knew she did it. I didn't know how often. Why would she agree to that? She needed the job." Charles sat at the end of the table and listened without interrupting. Evelyn glanced toward him before continuing. "And Mr. Vale knew which people needed the job badly enough not to make noise." The room went quiet. Margaret asked, "What do you mean by which people?" Evelyn chose her words carefully. "Single mothers. Older staff who didn't want to start over somewhere else. People with family on their insurance. Folks who couldn't afford to walk out over 20 minutes here, or an hour there." Charles looked down at his notes. "And Denise?" "She had Annie." That answer required no explanation. Later, HR found 2 promotion recommendations, including the copy Evelyn had saved. A third came from a former housekeeping supervisor who had left the estate 3 years earlier. All 3 described Denise as dependable, organized, capable of training staff, and able to manage domestic operations when supervisors were absent. All 3 had gone nowhere. Margaret placed one email in front of Charles. The original recommendation read, "Denise is effectively running domestic operations whenever Mr. Vale is away. Strongly recommend consideration for assistant supervisory role." Preston's reply contained a single sentence. "She is more useful where she is." Charles read it twice. "That's it?" "That's all he wrote." Dana handed him another printed email from a year later. This one discussed a guest services opening. A supervisor had suggested Denise because she already knew the routines and had worked with visiting families for years. Preston's response was longer. "Denise performs well in support functions but is better suited to back-of-house responsibilities. For guest-facing roles, presentation and polish remain important." Charles sat very still. Margaret watched him. "There's no explicit reference to race." "I can read." "I know. I'm telling you how HR would evaluate it. We look at pattern, comparators, promotion history, documented qualifications, and whether those standards were applied equally. So do that." "We are." The pattern was not subtle once they laid it out. Two employees with less experience than Denise had been promoted into guest-facing supervisory jobs. Denise had helped train both of them. One had worked at Whitmore Estate for less than 3 years. Charles leaned back and rubbed the bridge of his nose. I signed off on the annual budget every year. Margaret answered carefully. You did. I saw compensation totals. Yes, and never once asked why a woman who had been here 12 years was still at the bottom of the structure. Margaret did not offer him an excuse. Charles appreciated that. Annie returned to the estate that afternoon only because Denise needed her employee insurance paperwork from HR. Her aunt was improving, though the fever had not fully broken, and Annie had been ordered to go straight there and straight home. She found Charles in the service courtyard after her meeting with Margaret. Duke was not with her this time. Denise had refused to let Annie drag that poor dog back into another corporate emergency. Charles looked tired. How was your aunt? Still mad at me, so probably better. That earned a small smile. Good sign. Annie noticed the folder in his hand. You found something. Yes. How bad? Charles hesitated. Worse than I expected. Annie looked toward the main house. If you give her a raise now, does that make it fair? The question stopped him. No, he said after a moment. Then what does? I don't know that anything makes 12 years disappear. Annie waited. Charles looked down at the folder. Fairness isn't a favor you hand somebody after years of taking from them. If the records confirm what they appear to show, then she gets what she earned. The system gets corrected, and the people responsible answer for what they did. Annie studied him. You didn't know. Charles's expression changed. I should have. You trusted Preston. I hired Preston. That's not the same thing. No, Charles said, but it doesn't erase my part either. I built a house where one man could decide what reached me, then congratulated myself because everything looked orderly. Annie said nothing. Charles continued more quietly. That kind of ignorance becomes a choice if it lasts long enough. For the first time since she had met him, Annie saw no defensiveness in his face, only responsibility. Margaret appeared at the courtyard door holding another file. Charles, we found something else. He looked at Annie. I think your aunt's paperwork is about to become a much larger conversation. Annie shifted the insurance envelope under her arm. Then don't make her carry it by herself. Charles nodded once. I won't. As he followed Margaret inside, Annie watched the door close behind him. 3 days earlier, she had come to Whitmore Estate asking for one chance to protect Denise's review. Now the question was no longer whether Denise deserved a raise. It was how many people had learned to accept less, because Preston Vale had decided silence was cheaper than fairness. Margaret led Charles back into the conference room and closed the door behind them. On the table lay a new stack of printed records, this time arranged by year rather than department. Dana Brooks had marked several pages with yellow tabs, while Whitmore's outside counsel, Martin Hale, sat at the far end with his glasses low on his nose. What did you find? Charles asked. Margaret pushed the first document toward him. It isn't only Denise. We expanded the comparison after the payroll irregularities showed the same approval credentials. There are 11 employees whose recorded hours were repeatedly reduced or adjusted after submission. 6 of them worked under domestic services, 3 in grounds, and 2 in maintenance. Charles turned several pages. All approved by Preston? Most directly. A few were processed by supervisors after emails from him telling them to control overtime. Martin spoke before Charles could respond. That matters. Cutting authorized overtime is one thing. Altering time already worked is another. We need to preserve the records exactly as they are and interview everyone separately. Charles nodded, but his eyes remained on the pages. Denise's case no longer stood alone. Her name was simply the one Annie had forced him to notice first. Margaret slid another sheet forward. There's also a pattern in promotions. Employees Preston described as better suited to support roles were disproportionately kept in back-of-house positions even when their evaluations were stronger than the people promoted ahead of them. Charles looked up. Are you telling me he was discriminating? I'm telling you there is enough evidence to investigate that seriously. We should not reduce this to one email or one phrase, but the pattern is there. Charles leaned back, the lingering headache from the carbon monoxide exposure pressing behind his eyes. He thought of Annie standing at the front entrance with torn skin inside her shoe, defending a woman who had spent 12 years doing more work than anyone had bothered to record. Then he thought of how easily he had accepted polished budgets and clean hallways as proof that the estate was being managed well. When can we put Preston in this room? Martin checked the documents in front of him. Now, if you want answers. But I recommend we make clear. This is an investigatory meeting. Margaret and I stay. We document everything. Call him. Preston arrived 15 minutes later in a dark suit and the same controlled expression he had worn for years whenever he delivered unpleasant news on someone else's behalf. He took the chair across from Charles, glanced at Margaret and Martin, then at the folders covering the table. This looks dramatic. Charles did not answer the remark. He placed the maintenance report in front of him first. You received 3 warnings about the heating system in the East Wing. Preston glanced down. We discussed this. No, you told me yesterday that maintenance decisions were routine. I'm asking now why a recommendation to replace a cracked heat exchanger was deferred twice after a technician warned of carbon monoxide risk. The reading at the time was not an emergency. The contractor disagrees. Contractors always recommend replacement. They make money replacing things. Charles's expression hardened. And you make money keeping the estate under budget. Preston's eyes flickered toward Margaret. If this is about my bonus structure, that was approved by you. It was. The admission seemed to surprise him. Charles continued. I approved a system that rewarded lower costs. I did not authorize you to ignore safety warnings, so the numbers looked better. Preston shifted in his chair. No one intended for you to get hurt. That is not a defense. Charles opened another folder. Now we have payroll. Preston looked at the spreadsheets and sighed. Charles, staff hours are adjusted constantly. People forget to clock out. People stay on the property talking after shifts. Supervisors correct records. Do supervisors also correct 9:43 p.m. to 6 p.m.? Preston said nothing. Margaret spoke calmly. We have multiple edits of that kind, all under your credentials or following instructions from you. I manage a large property. If department heads let overtime run unchecked, someone has to control it. Before the work happens, Charles said, not after people have already done it. Preston looked at him with growing irritation. You wanted efficiency. Charles's voice remained low. I wanted competence. You gave me cruelty and called it efficiency. The room went still. Preston leaned forward. You think I'm cruel because a few housekeepers didn't get everything they wanted? This estate employs dozens of people. Somebody always believes they deserve another dollar, another title, another exception. My job is to keep standards from collapsing every time someone has a personal hardship. Charles slid Denise's old recommendation across the table. She was recommended for promotion 3 times. She was more useful where she was. You wrote that? Yes, because it was true. She trained people who were later promoted over her. They had better presentation for guest-facing roles. Charles held his gaze. What does that mean? Preston paused just long enough. It means exactly what it says. No. It means you hid behind language vague enough that you never had to say what you actually meant. Preston's restraint finally cracked. You are letting an 18-year-old girl turn you against the man who has kept this place running for 15 years. Charles did not raise his voice. Annie got me to ask one question. Everyone else answered it. You benefited from this system too. That stopped the room. Preston sat back, sensing he had finally found the one argument Charles could not dismiss. You had your clean house, your meals on time, your staff available whenever you came home. Costs stayed down. Problems stayed away from your desk. Don't sit there now and pretend you were some innocent bystander. Charles looked at him for several seconds. Then he nodded. You're right. Preston blinked. I benefited from it. I trusted the reports, enjoyed the results, and never asked what it cost the people producing them. Charles rested both hands on the table. That is my responsibility. It does not erase yours. He pushed the maintenance reports, payroll edits, and promotion records into one stack. How many years, Preston? Charles, how many years have you been making people disappear inside my own house? Preston's face tightened. That is an absurd way to describe management. It is the most accurate description I have heard all week. Martin placed a document on the table. Charles did not need to read it. Effective immediately, your access to Whitmore estate systems, payroll, personnel records, maintenance approvals, and staff supervision is revoked. You are suspended pending completion of the investigation. Security will collect your keys and company devices before you leave. Preston stared at him. You're throwing away 15 years over this? Charles shook his head. No, I'm finally looking at what those 15 years contained. Preston stood. anger pushing color into his face. But Martin rose with him and quietly reminded him that any destruction or removal of company records would carry consequences. That was enough to stop whatever final speech Preston had intended. At the door, Preston looked back once. "You'll regret turning your own staff against management." Charles met his eyes. They were never against management. They were against being treated as if their work didn't belong to them. The door closed behind Preston. Charles remained seated for a long moment, staring at Denise Carter's file. Then he picked up his phone. When Annie answered, he did not waste time. "I need your aunt's address." Her voice immediately became cautious. "Why?" "Because an apology delivered through somebody else isn't much of an apology." There was a short silence. Then Annie gave him the address. Charles Whitmore arrived at the Carter house just after 10 the next morning in a dark SUV with no driver, no assistant, and no stack of people following behind him. Annie had expected something more complicated when he called to ask whether Denise was awake. Instead, he pulled up alone, stepped out carrying a paper bag from a neighborhood cafe and a thick folder under one arm, then stood on the porch for a moment as if knocking on this particular door required more thought than entering any boardroom he owned. Duke announced him first. "Duke, enough," Annie called as she opened the door. The German shepherd stopped barking but remained between her and the visitor. Charles looked down at him. "I see security has recovered. He's been expecting a promotion. I'm beginning to think he'll get one before I do." Annie almost smiled, then remembered why Charles was there. "She's in the living room. Her fever came down last night, but she's still weak." "I won't stay long." He lifted the paper bag slightly. "Chicken soup. The woman at the cafe assured me it cures everything short of bad judgment. You bought enough for 4 people. I wasn't sure how much Duke charges for consultation." That earned a quiet laugh from Annie before she stepped aside. The Carter home was small and carefully kept. Family photographs covered one wall. Graduation pictures mixed with older snapshots of Annie as a child sitting on Denise's lap, missing front teeth and grinning at the camera. Charles noticed a worn recliner, a stack of mail held beneath a ceramic salt shaker, and a sewing basket beside the couch. Nothing looked neglected. Everything looked used. Denise sat beneath a quilt with a mug of tea in both hands. The moment she saw him, she tried to stand. "Mr. Whitmore." Charles crossed the room quickly. "Please don't." "I should get up." "You absolutely should not. I'm your employee. Today you're sick, and I'm standing in your house without an appointment from HR, so I think we can both survive if you stay seated." Denise settled back reluctantly. Annie took the soup from him and disappeared toward the kitchen, though she stayed close enough to hear. Charles sat in the chair across from Denise. For a few seconds neither spoke. Without the distance of the estate between them, Denise seemed smaller than Charles remembered, not physically, but in the way illness stripped away the practiced energy of someone accustomed to working through exhaustion. "I owe you an apology," he said. Denise looked down at her tea. "For what happened with Annie?" "For much more than that." She raised her eyes. Charles set the folder on the coffee table. "Preston Vale has been suspended. Our investigation found payroll adjustments, blocked promotion recommendations, unpaid work, and serious maintenance failures. We're still reviewing records." Denise did not react with the satisfaction Annie might have expected. Instead, she asked, "Is everyone getting their hours looked at, or just me?" Charles paused. "Everyone." "Good." That single word told him more about her than several personnel reports had. He leaned forward slightly. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Denise gave him a long look, then glanced toward the window. "When exactly would I have done that?" Charles did not answer. She continued, her voice calm rather than bitter. "You came home between trips. You had meetings, guests, calls. Preston decided who went upstairs and who stayed in the back. I worked in the back of the house. Mr. Whitmore, people like me don't usually get invited into the owner's office to explain why the owner's manager is treating them unfairly. You could have written to me. Maybe. Why didn't you?" Denise rubbed one thumb along the edge of the mug. "Because people who need a paycheck learn to measure risk differently from people who sign the checks." Charles sat very still. "If I complained and Preston convinced you I was difficult, I lost my job. If I stayed quiet, Annie stayed in school and the lights stayed on. I didn't like the choice, but it was still a choice I understood." From the kitchen doorway, Annie lowered her eyes. Charles looked toward the family photographs again. "Preston did what he did." Denise waited. but I built a system where I never had to see it, Charles continued. I trusted one man to tell me whether everyone else was being treated fairly. Then I called the absence of complaints proof that things were fine. Denise studied him for several seconds, then fixed the system. There was no accusation in her voice. That made the words harder to ignore. I intend to. Not just for me. No. Not just until everyone calms down. No. She nodded once. Then that matters more than an apology. Charles opened the folder and removed several pages. There's something else. Denise immediately frowned. If this is a check, put it back. It isn't. If it's money because you feel guilty, that's worse. Annie covered a smile with her hand. Charles looked toward her. Does everyone in this family negotiate before hearing the offer? Yes, Annie said. Usually aggressively. Denise ignored her. What is it? Charles handed over the first page. It was Evelyn's recommendation from 2 years earlier. Denise read slowly. Her expression changed when she reached the sentence describing her as capable of supervising domestic operations. I never saw this. I know. He gave her another. Then another. 3 recommendations. Years apart. All praising work Denise had performed without the title or pay that went with it. Her eyes remained on the pages. Charles spoke carefully. When you're healthy enough to return, I want to discuss a position called Estate Services Manager. Denise looked up immediately. No. Annie stepped into the room. Aunt Denise. No. Denise kept her eyes on Charles. I don't want a promotion because you nearly died and suddenly feel guilty about everybody Preston mistreated. Charles nodded. Neither do I. That stopped her. He tapped the papers in her hands. That's why I brought evidence instead of flowers. Your own coworkers recommended you before Annie ever walked through my door. The audit shows you were already performing parts of the job. I'm not offering you something new because I feel sorry for you. I'm asking whether you want the title, authority, and pay for work you've been doing without them. Denise looked down again. Charles gave her time. After a while, she said, What happens to the people whose overtime was taken? They'll be paid what the records confirm they're owed. And the safety problems? Independent inspection. No manager can defer a safety repair alone anymore. Denise finally looked at him. Justice isn't making somebody grateful for finally getting what they earned. Charles nodded. No, ma'am, it isn't. For the first time, something in Denise's face softened. She closed the folder and rested it on her lap. I'll read the job description when the doctor clears me. That's all I'm asking. Charles rose to leave, but Denise stopped him. Mr. Whitmore? He turned. Thank Annie. Charles looked toward the young woman standing beside Duke. I already have. Denise shook her head. Do it again. She walked farther than either of us did. Charles smiled faintly. For 12 years, Denise Carter had been told where she belonged. That morning, in her own living room, she finally held proof that her work had belonged somewhere higher all along. 3 weeks later, Denise Carter sat behind the wheel of her old sedan at the entrance to Whitmore Estate with both hands resting on the steering wheel and the engine still running. Her doctor had finally cleared her to return on a reduced schedule for the first week. The fever was gone, the cough had eased, and although she still tired more quickly than she liked to admit, there was enough strength back in her voice for Annie to stop hovering every time she stood up. That morning, Annie had tried to come with her. You don't need to escort me to work, Denise had said while buttoning a dark blue blouse. I'm not escorting you. I'm making sure you don't turn around. Denise had given her a look. I worked there 12 years before you learned how to drive. And for 12 years you parked in the back. That had ended the argument. Now Denise sat alone at the fork in the estate drive. The left road curved toward the service entrance she had used almost every working day for more than a decade. She knew every pothole in it, every delivery schedule, every place the pavement flooded after a hard rain. Her hands moved instinctively toward the turn signal. Then she looked to the right. The main drive climbed toward the house between long white fences and bare-limbed trees. Management parking was near the side entrance of the main house, a place Denise had passed countless times while carrying laundry, guest trays, or boxes that someone else had forgotten to move. For several seconds she did nothing. Then she turned right. At the main house, Charles Whitmore stood in the front hall speaking with Margaret Shaw when he saw Denise through the windows. He stopped in the middle of a sentence. Margaret followed his gaze. She came. She said she would. You sound surprised. Charles watched Denise get out of the car slowly, close the door, then stand for a moment, as if taking in the building from an unfamiliar angle. No, he said. I think I'm surprised by how different the same place can look depending on which door you use. Margaret gave him a small nod and left him there. Denise entered carrying a leather handbag and a folder containing the final version of her new job description. The title at the top still felt strange when she read it. Estate Services Manager. The position gave her responsibility for housekeeping, linen and laundry operations, coordination with the kitchen, guest service preparation, and staffing across the domestic side of the estate. More important to Denise, she would report directly to Charles instead of through Preston's old office. The salary was higher than anything she had earned before. The corrected overtime from the audit had already appeared in her bank account the previous Friday. She had stared at the deposit for almost 10 minutes. Not because it felt like a gift, because it did not. Charles met her near the entrance. "Morning, Denise." She stopped. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore. You know you can call me Charles." "I know." He waited. Denise raised one eyebrow. "That doesn't mean I'm going to." A smile touched his face. "Fair enough." Before he could say more, the door to the service hall opened, and Evelyn stepped through carrying a clipboard. She saw Denise and froze. "Well, look who finally decided to come back and tell us what we're doing wrong." Denise's face softened. "Somebody has to." Evelyn walked over and hugged her carefully. "You look better." "I am better. You still look too skinny." "I was sick, Evelyn. I've been sick before. I ate pie. That explains several things." Evelyn laughed, and the sound carried into the hallway. More staff began appearing. Carla came from the guest wing. Tom stepped out of the kitchen wiping his hands on his apron. 2 laundry workers leaned through the service doorway, and one of the stable hands wandered in after hearing that Denise had arrived. Someone started clapping. Denise immediately frowned. "Oh no." Another person joined. "Stop that." Within seconds, the whole hall was applauding. Denise looked embarrassed enough to turn around and leave. "All right," she said, raising both hands. "That is enough. If you've got time to stand around clapping, the laundry room is already behind." The applause broke into laughter. Charles watched from a few feet away. There was no ceremony, no speech, no banner. Denise would have hated all 3, yet he could see what her personnel file had failed to show. People did not simply like her. They trusted her. Carla stepped forward. "Congratulations, Miss Carter." "Thank you. And just so you know, I didn't touch the West linen closet while you were gone." "Good. I did consider it." "That was your first mistake." More laughter. Denise finally looked at Charles. "See what happens when I'm gone?" "I'm beginning to." Her expression changed for a moment. Not forgiveness exactly, but recognition that he had meant what he said in her living room. Charles gestured toward the study. "We have a management meeting in 10 minutes. Denise looked instinctively toward the back hallway. "Through there?" "No." He pointed toward the main corridor. "Conference room is this way." It was a small thing, but both of them understood it. Denise drew a slow breath and followed. Annie arrived during lunch with Duke beside her, and a paper bag from the cafe Denise liked. She found her aunt standing near the new office, arguing with Charles over a proposed staffing chart. "I'm telling you, this won't work," Denise said. Charles tapped the page. "You haven't even heard the rest." "I heard enough of the first half. You've been manager for 3 hours, and already I've saved you from one bad idea." Annie leaned against the doorway. "Should I come back later?" Denise turned. "What are you doing here?" "Bringing lunch because somebody told me managers forget to eat too." Duke walked straight past Annie and sat beside Denise. Charles looked down at him. "Traitor. He goes where the food is," Annie said. While Denise opened the bag, Annie reached into her pocket and pulled out the small white handkerchief with DC, stitched in blue at one corner. "You left this with me." Denise looked at it for a moment, then shook her head. "Keep it." Annie frowned. "It was Grandma's." "I know." "Then why?" Denise folded Annie's fingers back around the cloth. "Because you carried it farther than I ever did." Annie's expression changed, and for once she did not have a quick answer. Charles quietly turned toward the window, giving them the privacy without leaving. A few minutes later, Denise went back to work, not through the service hall where she had spent 12 years waiting for someone else to decide what she was worth, but down the main corridor toward a meeting she was expected to lead. Respect came first between Denise and Charles. Not romance, not gratitude, and certainly not rescue. That was why whatever came next had a chance to be real. Over the next few months, Denise and Charles settled into a rhythm neither of them had expected. Most of it was ordinary work. Denise reorganized staff scheduling so the same people were not always asked to cover emergencies. She changed the way guest requests were logged, added clear responsibility lists to every department, and insisted that no employee stay past a shift without their time being recorded properly. Charles approved the changes, though not always without argument. One Friday evening, they stood in the kitchen after a long meeting while most of the staff had already gone home. Denise was stirring a pot on the stove, more out of habit than obligation, when Charles wandered in and lifted the lid. "Is that Sunday gravy?" Denise did not look up. "Depends. On what? Whether you plan to take credit for it again." Charles laughed. "I believe I've learned my lesson." "You say that now? I've been publicly humiliated by an 18-year-old and a German shepherd. I'm a changed man." Denise finally smiled. "That dog has better instincts than most executives." They ate at the kitchen table instead of the formal dining room. It became something they did occasionally after long days, especially when neither had the energy for ceremony. Charles learned that Denise preferred her coffee with too much cream, that she hated wasting food, and that she still checked Annie's location when it got late even though Annie was legally an adult. Denise learned that Charles rarely slept well after business trips, that he called his mother every Sunday until she died, and that he had spent most of his adult life becoming too busy to notice when his house stopped feeling like a home. Their friendship grew in conversations that did not demand anything from either of them. Charles did not try to impress her with money. Denise did not treat him as though wealth excused bad judgment. When he was wrong, she told him. When she was stubborn, he told her that too. One afternoon, Annie arrived after a part-time shift in guest services and found the two of them arguing over staff housing repairs. "You're replacing all the windows at once?" Denise asked. "It's more efficient. It's also going to turn 12 apartments into construction zones at the same time. We can move people temporarily." "To where?" Charles paused. Denise folded her arms. Annie leaned toward Evelyn, who was sorting invoices nearby. "How long has this been going on?" 20 minutes. "Who's winning?" Evelyn glanced at Charles's face. "Your aunt." 5 minutes later, Charles agreed to stagger the repairs. He caught Annie smiling. "You find this amusing?" "A little. Your aunt is very difficult." Denise turned. "You hired me. I'm beginning to understand the cost." Annie laughed and headed toward the office. Her own place at Whitmore Estate had become official not long after Denise returned. Her title was Guest Services and Estate Assistant, which sounded grander than the actual work. She helped prepare guest rooms for special events, handled simple office filing, delivered paperwork between departments, checked inventory, and occasionally ran errands across the property. The hours were flexible enough that she could study, and the pay was better than the restaurant job she had expected to take after graduation. The staff liked her because she worked without pretending any task was beneath her. Stable hands teased her about Duke. Evelyn made sure she ate on long afternoons. Tom kept slipping leftovers into containers for her to take home. Duke, meanwhile, had become impossible to ignore. One morning, Annie came into the service office and found a small brass-colored sign mounted beside a dog bed Charles had ordered for him. Duke, Assistant Director of Security, compensation, 2 meals, unlimited biscuits. Annie stared at it. Charles stood in the doorway, looking pleased with himself. "He wants dental." Charles nodded seriously. "Talk to his union. He also wants paid vacation. He sleeps 14 hours a day. That's recovery time." Charles shook his head. "You really are exhausting. My aunt says the same thing." The joke faded later that afternoon when Charles noticed Annie studying a college brochure during her break. The cover showed nursing students in blue scrubs, standing outside a Lexington hospital. He sat across from her. "You planning to apply?" Annie quickly closed it. Eventually. Eventually usually means no. It means when I can afford it." Charles leaned back. "Denise told me you wanted nursing school. She talks too much. She's proud of you." Annie looked down at the brochure. "Tuition's more than I thought. Books, lab fees, uniforms. I'll figure it out." Charles was quiet for a moment. "Let me help." Annie's head came up immediately. "No, I haven't even explained. You said help. I heard enough. This isn't charity. Then let me pay it back." Charles studied her face. He had learned not to argue with Annie's pride as though it were a problem to correct. Her need to earn things came from years of watching Denise stretch every dollar. "All right," he said. We do it through the employee education program. We have one? We do now. Annie narrowed her eyes. You just made that up. I prefer expanded and existing benefit. She almost smiled. How does it work? The estate advances part of your tuition. You keep working part-time around your classes. A small amount comes out of each paycheck after you start. How small? Charles told her. Annie stared at him. You moved the decimal. I did no such thing. That's barely repayment. Inflation. Move it back. Annie. Mr. Whitmore. He sighed. You negotiate like your aunt. Thank you. That was not a compliment. It sounded like one. In the end, they settled on an amount Annie considered fair, and Charles considered unnecessarily stubborn. When she signed the agreement, Charles handed her the pen and said, There's a difference between owing someone and being beholden to them. Annie read the final line before signing. I'm still paying. I figured you would. That evening, Denise found Annie sitting on the back steps with Duke, the nursing brochure open across her knees. You accepted? Annie nodded. With repayment. Of course. You sound disappointed. Denise sat beside her. No. I'm just realizing I raised somebody almost as stubborn as I am. Annie rested her head briefly against Denise's shoulder. Across the courtyard, Charles stepped outside carrying his coat. He saw them and stopped, choosing not to interrupt. Months earlier, Annie had walked to Whitmore Estate because she believed accepting help meant losing something of herself. Now she was beginning to understand that dignity did not always mean carrying every burden alone. Sometimes it meant choosing the terms under which you allowed someone to stand beside you. 6 months after Annie first walked through the gates of Whitmore Estate, Sunday mornings no longer felt quite the same. The house was still quiet before 9. The long drive still curved between white fences. The horses still moved across the fields in the pale Kentucky light, and the stone walls of the main house had not changed. What had changed was harder to see from the outside. In the east wing, new carbon monoxide detectors had been installed beside every major sleeping and working area. The old heating unit near Charles's study had been replaced months earlier. Along with 2 other systems the safety audit had flagged. Maintenance requests were now logged in a shared system that required a second approval before any safety item could be postponed. Red tags on urgent repairs could not be removed by one manager alone. In payroll, overtime adjustments required documentation. Performance reviews carried more than one signature. Employees could raise concerns through HR without routing them through the estate manager. Several staff members had received corrected back pay, and more than one job title had been changed after the audit showed that the work people actually performed had outgrown the names printed on their badges. Preston Vale's office had been emptied long ago. No one talked about him much anymore. That, Denise believed, was as it should be. Justice was not supposed to leave everyone staring backward forever. At some point, the people who had been overlooked deserved the chance to build something better without having to keep proving what had happened to them. That Sunday, Denise stood in the estate kitchen with the sleeves of her sweater pushed to her elbows, stirring a pot of Sunday gravy while sunlight fell across the long wooden work table. She was not there because anyone had ordered her to cook. She was not covering a missing shift or fixing someone else's mistake. She was cooking because she wanted to. That difference mattered. At the table behind her, Annie was bent over an anatomy textbook in Navy nursing school scrubs, one hand holding a yellow highlighter, while the other rested beside a mug of coffee she had forgotten to drink. Her hair was pulled back, and a stethoscope still stuck out of the side pocket of the backpack she had dropped near the chair. Duke slept under the table, stretched across the floor, in a way that forced everyone to step around him. His brass-colored sign now hung beside the service office. Assistant Director of Security. Compensation, 2 meals, unlimited biscuits. Annie still insisted the benefits package was weak. The back door opened. Charles came in carrying his coat over one arm and a small overnight bag in the other. He had returned from Chicago less than an hour earlier, but instead of going upstairs, he had followed the smell from the kitchen. He stopped near the stove. Is that Sunday gravy? Denise kept stirring. No. Charles looked at the pot. That is clearly Sunday gravy. Then why did you ask? I was trying to be polite. You're getting worse at it. Annie smiled at her textbook without looking up. Charles set his coat over a chair and reached for a spoon. Denise slapped the back of his hand lightly with a dish towel. Not ready. It smells ready. It isn't. It's my house. Denise finally looked at him. And my kitchen. Annie turned a page. I'd listened to her. Charles looked under the table. Duke, the dog opened one eye. Whose side are you on? Duke stood, stretched, walked past Charles, and sat beside Denise. Annie looked up at last. The side with food. Charles stared at the dog. After everything I've done for you. Duke's attention remained fixed on the stove. Denise shook her head. You gave him a job title and a dog bed. Don't confuse that with loyalty. I gave him unlimited biscuits. That was your first mistake. Charles pulled out a chair beside Annie. How's school? Annie made a face. Ask me after pharmacology. That bad? I'm beginning to think every medication was named by somebody who hated students. Denise laughed softly. Charles glanced at the tuition statement tucked beneath Annie's textbook. You know you could reduce your work hours this semester. I already did. I mean more. I heard you. And? And I said I heard you. Charles leaned back. You negotiate everything. Annie finally looked at him. You moved the repayment amount again. I adjusted it. You lowered it. Cost of living review. You are impossible. Denise pointed the wooden spoon at Annie. Don't say that like you're different. Charles smiled. Thank you. That wasn't support for you. I'll take what I can get. The kitchen door opened again, and Evelyn came in carrying a clipboard. Morning. Denise looked over her shoulder. You're early. I came to tell you the Henderson room needs a later checkout and Carla swapped Tuesday with Marjorie. Logged? Yes. Overtime? Already approved. Denise nodded. Good. Evelyn looked toward Annie. You eat yet? I'm studying. That wasn't what I asked. Annie sighed. No, ma'am. Evelyn crossed to the counter, cut a biscuit in half, wrapped it in a napkin, and put it on top of Annie's textbook. Now you are. Charles watched the exchange. 6 months earlier, moments like that would have passed around him unnoticed. Food appeared. Rooms were ready. People covered for one another. The house simply worked. He had thought that was management. Now he understood how much of it had always been people taking care of people. He also understood what happened when leadership enjoyed the result but never asked who was paying the cost. Denise poured coffee into a mug and set it in front of him. Black. He looked at it. You remembered. She gave him a dry look. I remembered before you knew who I was. The words carried no bitterness now, but neither of them pretended the history had disappeared. Charles wrapped one hand around the mug. I know. Denise went back to the stove. That small answer was enough. Outside the kitchen window, 2 grounds workers crossed toward the stable. One waved when he saw Charles. Charles raised a hand in return and called the man by name. Denise noticed. She did not say anything. Neither did Charles. Some changes did not need witnesses. Annie returned to her book, then stopped after a moment. Aunt Denise? Yes? Do you remember that handkerchief? Denise turned slightly. The one my mother made? Annie nodded and touched the pocket of her scrub top. I keep it with me on clinical days. Denise smiled. Good. Still think it's just for sweat? Mostly. Charles looked between them. I feel there's a story I'm not being told. There are several, Denise said. Will I ever hear them? Depends how long you behave. Annie laughed. Charles looked around the kitchen. Annie in nursing scrubs. Denise standing where she chose to stand. Duke waiting shamelessly for something to fall. Evelyn checking a schedule no one had manipulated behind her back. Months earlier, Annie had arrived at his front door asking for one thing. A chance to fill in for her aunt. She had not asked to expose a broken system. She had not planned to save his life, challenge his trust in Preston, or force him to reconsider how many people he had failed to see. She had simply refused to let Denise's work disappear because illness kept her home for one day. That refusal had changed more than a salary. It had changed the house. Denise tasted the gravy, considered it, then finally set a spoon beside Charles. No. He took a bite. The roasted garlic came after the onions, just as it always had. Charles smiled. Perfect. Denise raised an eyebrow. Of course it is. Annie closed her textbook for a moment and watched them both. There were no speeches that morning, no plaques, no photographs for newspapers. The corrected paychecks had already been issued. The furnace had been repaired. The titles had been changed. The doors were open to the people whose work had always earned them a place inside. Justice did not always arrive with sirens or courtroom doors. Sometimes it came quietly, in a repaired heater, a corrected paycheck, a name finally placed beside the work it had always done, and a front entrance that no longer told the right person to go around back. Under the table, Duke heard Denise open the biscuit tin. He stood immediately. Charles looked down at him. Unbelievable. Annie smiled. Told you. Duke walked straight to Denise. The side with food. This story reminds us that injustice does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it hides in unpaid hours, stolen credit, closed doors, and the quiet assumption that certain people should simply be grateful for whatever they are given. Annie's courage forces everyone around her to see what had been ignored for years. Dignity is not a gift from the powerful, and fairness is not a favor given after someone has already earned it. True leadership means paying attention, taking responsibility, and correcting what is wrong even when the truth is uncomfortable. Most of all, the story shows that one honest voice, backed by love and courage, can open a door that has been closed for far too long. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.